Hello, everybody, and welcome to Gript's Election Coverage 2019. I'm joined by Gary Kavanagh and Niamh Breen, and we're here to discuss the election results that we've seen thus far and also to follow them as they emerge in various constituencies like Dublin, Midlands Northwest, and Ireland South. So, folks, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
What was your reaction to the votes thus far?
That I feel lied to and misled by exit polls.
Do you?
It's been a while since I've been so betrayed by a poll, although I feel worse for the journalists who wrote endless think pieces about how this was the end of all non-green politics, and then there's no green wave, there's barely, like, they did very well, but it's not. 1 in 20 people in the country voted for them. It's not the end of everything else.
Yeah, I think the exit poll got it spectacularly wrong, and people might look at the difference between the votes projected from the poll and what was recorded and think it's not that significant, but it is. You know, for a poll to show that, for example, Kieran Cuff, the exit poll said he was on 23% and he came in at 17.5%. That's a very significant difference, and I think the biggest, Gary's totally right, the biggest impact the poll had was that it changed the narrative around the election. All of a sudden, all we heard for 3 days was green wave, green tsunami, Leo Varadkar saying this had to change, how we did policy and politics, everything like that. And in fact, when the results came in, the differences, were quite substantial, really. If you looked at Saoirse McHugh, who everyone was saying was definitely going to take a seat based on the exit poll, because she was polling at 12%, which is, would definitely put her in the running there. But she came in at 8.5, good difference
She's behind
there.
Peter Casey in Midlands Northwest.
She was in the first preference count, yeah. And again, that's really surprised people because he polled at 7% in the exit poll and came in the first count then at 10%. And overall, I think in the Red C poll, it was a Red C poll for Archie TG Carr, yeah, and the Greens, I think, was showing at 9%, and they came in overall in the local elections at 5.6%. So big differences between what the exit poll predicted and what actually happened.
And so why were the exit polls so inaccurate?
So I think in this case it's off so much it has to be a sampling bias, which is to say you want to ask a random sampling of people, so you'll get a fairly accurate answer. And I don't think it was as random as it should have been.
Because the people leaving the booths just aren't, they're not all people who stop with the Red C poster.
Yeah, I mean, if 1 in 20 people voted for the Greens, it looks like the exit polls about 1 in 10 of the people they asked were voting for the Greens. So either people just lied to them or they just asked the wrong people. It's a sampling error, and I would suspect it's such a big difference. It's a sampling error.
It's cool to be green nowadays, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing you see with the media, because the media loved this result and they wanted to run with this message. I mean, they always pick up on a narrative when it suits them as well. So you're not going to see, I think, any of the journalists who wrote these headlines about tsunamis and green waves and how everything had changed in politics, you're not going to see them retracting them anytime soon, I think, because this suits them to hammer home this message and to insist that government policy changes in relation to green issues. But you're right, they did have some really good results in Dublin in particular. I think like the percentage of the vote did double since the last local election. So it was a good election for the Greens, just wasn't a tsunami or the kind of wave we're hearing about.
I think it more than double. I think they were on less than 2% last time, and now they're up to about 5.5 in that kind of region.
Yeah.
So that's a fantastic result for the Greens. But if they had gotten 9 or even 12%, if you're putting in the margin of error, that would have been an unbelievable.
And in Dublin,
turnabout.
it's just gotten very interesting to see in Dublin, where it seems Lynn Boylan's votes will be distributed and might allow Claire Daly to leapfrog over Barry Andrews.
I suspect, considering the amount of barristers who are now in with the count, that is going to the courts.
Yeah.
So whatever happens now may change very rapidly. We have one of our ministers is on TV one day saying, oh, the votes go this way, and now he's saying the votes go the other way. So even the people who wrote the law don't seem to know what should happen here.
John Paul Phelan actually issued a retraction on Twitter, correcting an earlier statement where he claimed that the votes didn't have to be distributed.
Well, that became very difficult for him when people pointed out he'd said exactly the opposite in the Shallot.
So it doesn't seem to have been thought through, really.
And there's going to be a repeat of this in Ireland South, it seems, I think, with Grace O'Sullivan.
I think the way this has happened with Brexit and the fact that it may have one number of seats or it may have an additional seat, that's massively changed who would win, because it changes the quota, it changes the redistribution patterns, I mean, I would have thought the fair thing to do was to actually carry out 2 different counts.
And can you just explain for people that don't know about that cold storage seat that's available in
So
Dublin
yeah,
and Ireland South?
because we were meant to get extra seats when Britain left the EU, and they haven't left yet, but they're hoping to go by the end of the year, although God knows if that will actually happen. We basically had an election for the number of seats we currently have,
which is 3 in Dublin and 4 in Ireland
yeah.
South.
And then we also used this election to pick the person who will get the new seats when they come online. So let's say if Britain goes in October, that person will then take their seat. But it means until October, they're not technically an MEP.
So Barry Andrews might be stuck in Dublin.
Sitting on the bench. I suppose the other big story, going back to the Dublin count, in the election was what happened to the Sinn Féin vote. And we're seeing something astonishing there. You know, the Sinn Féin vote's gone down from 15% to just under 10%. In terms of a fall, that's a 33% fall, maybe even more, maybe up to 35% of a fall in support for Sinn Féin. And it's funny, I think Mary Lou McDonald, all weekend, people have been asking her reaction to this, have been kind of making projections about what this will mean for her. And one of the most interesting things I saw on Facebook was somebody took the photograph of Mary Lou McDonald and Michelle O'Neill after the referendum on abortion, where they held up a sign saying the North is next, then crossed out the North and written in Mary Lou is next, because it's the 3rd bad election for Mary Lou.
Yeah, I think that's actually the real story of this election. It's not a green wave, although the Greens did well. It's how poorly Sinn Féin have done. Sinn Féin, pretty much since the mid-90s, have been a fairly upward trajectory. I think there's only been one general election since the mid-90s where they haven't increased their vote share, and then they fell by something like 0.5%. But to go from 15% to 9%.
Very bad result.
And they were even hemorrhaging councillors before that.
They were, and there were claims of bullying. They don't seem to kind of have the ground game they once had, the passion behind it. But just on a narrative level, up to this point, it was Sinn Féin are growing exponentially.
So what is the explanation?
Well, some of it, I think, is people are pointing to the leadership issues in Sinn Féin and a culture of bullying, but I think some of it has to come down to, you're seeing a lot of commentary on this on social media in particular, around Aontú and around what has been really a breakthrough election for them, you know, in that they have managed to get people elected. Coming from a party that was only established 4 months ago, as we all know that story with Paddy Tobin, topped the poll in Ballybor and Cavan, Sarah O'Reilly, they're, I think, 8,000 votes over the quota. Great election for her.
And that'll really sting Fianna Fáil, I think, because Sarah O'Reilly was co-opted
she
on the
was,
council
she
as
was.
a Fianna Fáil candidate.
She was, but Emer Tobin, also a poll topper in Meath, and then got a seat in Wexford as well with Jim Codd. And in about 7 other constituencies, Aontú came very, very close to taking a seat. Mary Sweeney in Donegal, Michael Ryan in Limerick, and Edward McManus in Castleknock. A really, really good performance there from him, and several others. And you could see in a lot of the counts, or a lot of the results in those local electoral areas, that they were eating into the Sinn Féin vote, that Aontú had done that. So that was definitely part of it.
So do they have a future in Irish electoral politics?
I think absolutely. I think people will have looked at the North and here, and the reporting around it is that this is a breakthrough vote for Aontú. This is what Aontú are describing it as themselves. That's what the political commentators are saying. It was being closely watched. You know, if they had sank here, if no one had been elected, or if no one had come close, it would have been very difficult, I think, for Aontú to go forward with any kind of enthusiasm. But they've got people elected, and they've done well, you know, in lots of other areas. So I would imagine they're looking now to the general election, looking at who did well, looking at who did, the kind of candidates they put forward then. I think they're probably going to concentrate on about 10 constituencies for the general election, which might be held sooner than we think.
I mean, that could happen anytime. I think the real thing for Aontú, because I'm not sure if this meets, I'm not sure what their internal projections were, how they thought they were going to do, and that's really how they'll judge this. Is it better than they thought they would do, or worse? What I do think is going to be a really big thing to Aontú is that the Tobin election. So that was in Paddy Tobin's backyard. It was someone with the same name. That was the concern there. Tobin splits from Sinn Féin. How much of that vote goes with him? Is he still electable? And the fact that someone with the same surname as him in his constituency was able to, I think they were joint poll topper, is going to be a great thing just internally for Aontú, because they're going to take that and go, okay, if we can do that in the general election, that makes it much more likely.
Will they be able to do it in the general election?
Well, I think this would indicate that they are in a better position than they probably thought they would do.
Yeah.
I think if you're joint poll topper at a local, you're probably going to think there's at least something you can do with the
decent
general.
support there, yeah.
And how will the government, do you think, react to the increase in Green support? And I know it's not as pronounced as the media portrayed it.
Well,
it seems there is going to be action taken.
I would say if the exit polls had been accurate, there would be a lot more support for it. But now that that's kind of fallen, you're going to have a weird thing where the government has talked about green issues all weekend.
Declared a climate emergency.
Which may have helped the Greens in
Which
the
may have helped the Greens, but
it happened a week before the vote.
To me, the vote is interesting from this point of view, because I think the EU elections are a bit of an oddity. You know, very often they use as a protest vote, or celebrities get elected. It's very difficult, very, very difficult for anyone who's not either a really big name or part of one of the bigger parties to make a breakthrough in the European elections, because the constituencies are, of course, enormous. It's really hard to get known. But a lot of the time people use it as a protest vote, and here I think it's almost like a virtue signalling. So you have people going, okay, I'm hearing a lot of stuff in the media about the world's going to end in 12 years if we don't do something about climate change, that everything's disastrous, the polar bears, the ice caps, everything. So I need to do something. So I'm going to vote Green for Kieran Coff and send him to Europe to deal with it, but I don't want to pay carbon taxes.
And I'm not going to get out of my Land Rover either.
But that's it. I'll drive in my Land Rover to the polling station, and I'll take a picture of myself on my smartphone, and I don't want to pay carbon taxes, because that's the reality of green policy.
No one wants to pay carbon taxes anyway, whether they're green or whether they're...
This is one area where I will actually agree with Sinn Féin, which is a rare thing on anything other than Irish unity. They're coming out and saying carbon taxes will hurt the poor.
Yeah.
Everyone else is saying no, they'll get their tax back, they won't be hurt. Carbon taxes will obviously hurt the poor. They have to hurt the poor because they have to change what you consume. If there's no financial cost to it, you're not going to change what you consume, and it's going to be pointless. So Sinn Féin are absolutely right on this. It will hurt people. It's designed to hurt people. If it doesn't, it's a failed policy.
And how will Sinn Féin rebuild in time for the general election? It could happen within a year.
Well, I mean, it's a question here of, was the last election for Sinn Féin just abnormally good, and this is their more natural resting place? Or is this an absolutely disastrous election and a reversal that could be permanent? I think what they'll do internally is they're going to find someone to blame.
Yeah.
Who will that be?
Not Mary Lou, I would imagine. Not Mary Lou. The leaders in Sinn Féin are never to blame. But one of the things that impacted, I think, on Sinn Féin's vote as well, and impacted on the vote for People Before Profit and Solidarity, was there was a very, very low turnout in working class areas. And I think Finglas recorded
14% in Finglas.
Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, that's definitely got to hurt those parties.
I think this election was either the lowest turnout for a local election I can ever remember, or if not the lowest, definitely one of the lowest. So in one way I'm not surprised the Greens did so well, because the people who are concerned about that issue are going to vote about it, because it's an actual ideological issue. Whereas most Irish parties don't really have that many ideological issues that you vote for them for. So if turnout had been higher...
And maybe people in those areas don't feel that Sinn Féin or People Before Profit are representing them anymore. Maybe they feel they're spending too much time on the culture wars and transgender issues, and they're not getting involved in a real way, like in what matters to people on the ground. It's hard to know that. It was very funny this morning to listen to Mannix Flynn and Kieran. Mannix Flynn is an independent councillor, just got re-elected in Dublin City Council, and Kieran Allen of People Before Profit having this enormous row on Sean O'Rourke because Mannix Flynn described People Before Profit at the count as being like ISIS or the Taliban. So
and that was because of the recount and the two candidates being so close. I think only 10 votes separated.
Yeah, he said that there was a lot of aggression and their behaviour was unacceptable, and he said in his view they're destroying the left and they've had a bad election. Maybe it's time for some self-examination.
And also actually the protest against Owen Murphy when the Minister for Housing walked into the town centre.
Yeah, I think Mannix Flynn talked about that as well.
Yeah. Maybe they'll dissolve, maybe they'll reform. I'm sure the Workers' Party has some other front they can use for election. They just keep ticking along.
Yeah, they do.
And so across the Irish Sea, we had big elections as well in Britain, and Nigel Farage seems to have done serious damage to the Tories.
The biggest party now in Britain.
He has done. On one level, yes, he's done really serious damage in that the Brexit Party is now, I think, 28 seats. It's probably the largest single party in the European Parliament.
Could one say that he's the most important politician of the 21st century thus far?
I would say he is the most important British politician
British
who has
politician.
failed to ever get elected to Westminster.
But maybe
But a huge success for him in this election.
the impact that he's
Incredible.
had on the EU in terms of being able to bring Britain out of it, almost, it seems they will now by October, the impact he's had on the Tory party, the oldest political party in the world, and maybe he's only rivaled by the likes of Donald Trump, who's made a seismic shift over.
He is obviously an incredibly influential politician, and he shows, I think, a lot of the influence you can have just by making your arguments without ever actually needing to get elected. Something we kind of saw in Ireland when Paul Murphy was elected, and the government just wildly pivoted to left-wing social policies because it terrified them. But I think on one hand he's actually quite helpful to the Tory party, because the Tory party is tearing itself apart over Brexit. Whereas now that the Brexit party has come out, and the Brexit party, I think the Tory party at one point in the European elections were polling at 9%. The Brexit party was polling higher than Labour and the Tories combined. So I think that kind of shows them that this is the direction the public wants to go. I would say his success combined with Theresa May's leaving has now made, and to be fair, this is a situation largely caused by the Irish government, has now made a no-deal Brexit not a certainty, but very close to it.
Because it's much more likely Boris will be elected leader of the Tories.
Boris, weirdly enough, I believe voted for May's deal, but Boris is, if anything, opportunistic and hated in Brussels. So if he sees this is the way the wind is going, he's going to go with it. But I would say at this point, you're almost certainly going to get a no deal.
And a big rise too, I think, a good election perhaps for EU critical candidates right across Europe, Hungary, France.
Yeah, I mean
Belgium.
the National Front. I don't think I've seen the final numbers, but when I saw the polling, they were predicted to become the largest party from France in the European, which may only be slight, but is a blow to Macron's kind of aura.
Yeah, but in Poland too, I think PIS did very well. 52%, no, that was Viktor Orban, I think 52% of the vote, but in Poland did very well, and it started talks in Poland about a Polish Brexit, whatever that's called.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know what they call that.
I think there's a slightly different debate there on is this good or bad for the EU? Because there is an argument that the rise of more Euro-critical parties in the EU is actually good for the EU, because it'll slow it down.
It might save them from themselves.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons a lot of the Eurosceptics I know loved the idea of Macron when he was being elected, Macron and Merkel together, because they figured they would dramatically overreach and it would destabilise the entire EU.
Yeah.
So that was why they supported them.
Yeah.
And so the Brexit party is now the largest national party in the EU Parliament, and it's joined by other forces like the National Front, by the League in Italy, and you're seeing a solid block of Eurosceptic parties really starting to...
You are on some level. They're all aligned on some level, but they're not going into the same European parties.
Yeah.
So at that party level, they're fragmented. However, they will agree on a lot of things, and there's lines of dialogues between them. So they will certainly work together on that.
Ireland seems to be really far behind the bell curve, doesn't it, on this issue of Euroscepticism?
We're kind of late to the party on a lot of things, I think, in terms of social change recently too, but on this issue, there's very little support for I think an Irish exit, really.
If you look at where Ireland was when it joined the EU and where it is now, rightly or wrongly, a lot of that is going to be credited to the EU, where if you're in, let's say, Britain, you are already a very prosperous country before the EU.
Yeah.
So it's
a
lot
kind
easier
of self-confidence that we just don't have in this country for whatever reason. Maybe it might be because we were a colony for so long, whatever. But certainly, I think Britain has a sense of its own identity, a sense that they can do things, stand on their own 2 feet. They don't need the European
Irish
Union.
media don't seem to grasp that here's a nation that just wants its sovereignty back and is confident enough to step out onto the world stage, whereas journalists here seem to play down Brexit time and again as a little England mentality.
To be honest, the Irish media's response to Brexit kind of highlighted how different Ireland and England actually are. Very similar in many ways, but Irish journalists and media did not seem to get how the Tory party think about things. The Tory party was never going to cede control over what they see as British territory. They just will not do it.
I think the Irish media too are just of one mind about Brexit anyway. Do you know what I mean? It's just Brexit is a terrible thing, and we won't have any discussion about it.
I mean,
like the way they are about an awful lot of things.
There were times during the early Brexit negotiation where the Irish government were clearly either lying or so uninformed about what they were talking about that they had no place being at that table, and they were simply let do it. There were very few journalists. The only journalist I can think of off the top of my head would be Dan O'Brien, who's not a journalist generally. He's
an economist.
He's an economist, and he was the only person who pointed out that what we were doing with the backstop, where we basically went to people and said, if you don't give us what we want, we will cause the worst scenario for ourselves.
Possible.
And he was the only one who went, that's kind of brinkmanship, because at some point they'll just go, okay, do it.
Yeah.
And we were sort of blessed because Theresa May was never going to do that, but also cursed in that now the backstop has become this all-consuming thing, which is probably going to destroy the process.
Yeah, but you're right. They'll never be held to account for that here. There's very little real debate ever around European issues in this country anyway.
No, I mean, I do
completely
remember
uncritical analysis by the media.
there was a period where it was Shane Ross and I think Simon Coveney, and they were talking about how they would avoid a hard border if there was no deal. And they didn't realise their microphones were still on.
Okay.
And Shane Ross said something about, like, how are we going to do this? And Simon Coveney said, well, we don't talk about that. And it was obviously clear that they knew what they were saying was not possible.
So there's no plan B?
I would be surprised at this point if there's a plan A.
Yeah.
We were going to spend 1 minute on the funniest or the most interesting things out of the campaign. I think everyone agreed Ben Gilroy's video had to be the video of the election.
I'd say Ben Gilroy's video was the best, and the best poster was for I can't remember who it was for, but it was a socialist feminist future, and it was someone in profile.
It was Rita Harold. I think she got 2%. Did she 2%?
That is a really good poster. I'll give her that.
Why did Ben Gilroy's video success not translate into more votes? Because he only got around, I think, 8,000 votes in the end.
Well, the video was huge. He had 1 million organic views, and that's pretty phenomenal.
So why did it not
when you're seeing those kind of
votes?
views, normally people are paying for them. So it was a phenomenally popular video. I think because it probably wasn't enough on its own. You know, like a video on its own won't get you elected. You need massive campaign. You need a huge amount of money. And like I said previously, the EU elections, the constituency is just enormous. It's incredibly difficult to get out there.
And he was excluded from the RTE debates.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the people who did succeed, they had even if you look at the independents who succeeded, like Wallace and Daly, like who looked like they're both going to get a seat, they had massive amounts of bus ads, billboards, you know, and a huge amount of effort and money goes into that. And they're already national names. Like everybody knows who Francis Fitzgerald is. Everybody knows these people. So
but
it's extremely difficult to break through that.
The TV debates in particular allowed the likes of Saoirse McHugh to boost herself onto the national stage.
They did, yeah, they did. And I mean, that's a real live question. I think that nobody is examining around the elections in Ireland and around how fair or unfair that is, that the status quo, the establishment parties always get the best crack of the whip when it comes to debates. I remember talking to someone from Aontú just before the vote, and they were saying that for a solid month before the vote, Aontú got 1 minute of airtime from RTE. It's very hard to break through that when you're up against people like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael who are on there permanently.
So is RTE the kingmaker in Irish politics?
Well, I mean, I'm sure if you asked RTE, they would simply say the elected parties, the bigger parties, have a mandate. Therefore, it's justifiable.
But that just keeps the status quo going forever. That's what that does.
But the thing that there is a balance there between.
Why not have two debates? Why not have mix it up? Do you know what I mean? I understand that if you have 17 candidates, you can't have a studio where everyone packs his shoulder to shoulder, but you can have a couple of debates.
If you have, let's say you have 5 candidates, and between them they have 80% of the vote share, and there's another 15 people there, eventually you're going to have to go, okay, well we'd rather have 4 and maybe 1 person from here than all of you, because that's not workable.
But in order to give voters all the information that they deserve, in order to make an informed choice, is it not incumbent upon the state broadcaster to allow candidates an equal amount of airtime?
I'm saying that they should have several debates. There's nothing that says you can't have more than 1 debate per constituency, especially for the EU election, because it's really 3 enormous constituencies. So if that meant you ended up having 6 or 9 debates, so what? I think that's much fairer than actually just saying, you know what, you're already elected, you can come in and talk. Anyone who's trying to break through that barrier, you never get a chance. Because they're by far the biggest influence when it comes like TV, RTE, dominates absolutely TV.
And the
in
lesser known
current
candidates
affairs.
actually won't create as much of a snooze fest as
Yeah,
the better
because
known
they're
ones.
so boring. Everyone who watched the debates this time around just had the same response. That was so boring. That was absolutely so boring. And maybe if you had more interesting people in there with something different to say, it might have been more interesting.